evening. Thank you for having me here, Alexandrina and Seke, and thank you for sourcing the antique monitor screen for my presentation. My name is Pardis. I'm a Herstory Teacher and part of a local Herstory research collective. I've always been interested in heritage. I grew up hearing stories about my community's collective ancestors, some of whom would have been treated unjustly and labelled as inferior. This took place in a time of modernity, when societies acted as if ideas like race and gender were real and biologically determined. These people who were discriminated against were called minorities, though in fact there were more of them across the world than those who acted as if they were the human default. As I got older, I wanted to find out how these minorities challenged those who I will call the default people, and I wanted to understand how these minorities helped to make the world what it has become today. My own heritage comes from multiple places, but within that I come from a line of Ashulks. The music historians in the room may know that traditionally Ashulks were travelling musicians in the region previously known as West Asia. Today we are recognised as one of many kinds of musicians who dedicate ourselves to creating and sharing new stories and myths, with the aim of transforming ourselves and our listeners through the rhythms, harmonies and dissonance we produce. In this presentation, I want to take a Herstorical approach into exploring how minorities in the early 21st century began to use practices of growth and resistance that were largely perceived as invalid by the epistemic paradigm they lived in. By epistemic paradigm, I mean a world that recognizes and works under certain forms of logical understanding. My case study looks at the work of Anni Movsisyan, a person who would have been gendered as a woman and recognized as either an artist or a dreamer according to different sectors of the society she lived in. I've chosen to look at this person because, like me, they were also interested in herstory and were a self-styled ashulk. Now, as a historian, I do find things such as employing historically used terms such as gender pronouns helpful, so I will refer to Anni as she or her. So you all have a copy of this, or you should do, on your tables to peruse further, as this slide may go fairly quickly. 200 years ago, the northwestern hemisphere was undergoing dramatic changes. Where we sit today, there used to be a 32 square kilometre city known as London, in the heart of a neoliberal empire called the United Kingdom. In the time of modernity, people were living in a world where defaults believed that they were entitled to force everyone else to live by their rules, the worst of which would be enforced upon the so-called minorities. This was before the paradigm shift that brought an end to the four pillars of injustice: global capitalism, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, and coloniality. The land that we are standing on today is where the subject of my research lived for the first half of her life. Anni was born here to parents who had migrated from Tehran in the Pomegranate Mountains, previously known as the northern part of Iran. The former nation-state was colloquially renamed after the paradigm shift in reference to the global famine of 2053. This event led to the worldwide guerrilla planting of crops that could protect against desertification or permanent flooding, depending on the environmental crises that regions would face. In Iran, farmers, activists, and whoever else that had access to seeds and other relevant resources would organize communal plantings of drought-resistant and desert-thriving crops like the pomegranate, sesame, mulberries, or barley. As a teenager, the artist was strongly influenced by her father's philosophical outlook, whose problematic secularism was tied to his 1970s Iranian communist upbringing. The scientific atheist position she once claimed wore off as she learned about the violence of regarding the Industrial Revolution and empire as bringers of equitable civilization, and the inaccuracy of perceiving science as a superior way of understanding the world. Bear in mind that during modernity, magic and other knowledge practices that did not revolve around post-Enlightenment rationality were largely dismissed as invalid forms of knowledge. With the Northwestern Hemisphere being home to the so-called Age of Reason that wrongly justified Euro-Christian dominion over the world, there were few magical practitioners in its geographical centre, though it is in Anni's time that we see this change ever more quickly. So Anni made performances, illustrations, magical objects, rituals, and music. She was curious about how magical and symbolic practices could help to move people closer to the futures they wished to imagine and be a part of. She wanted to learn more about traditions of her heritages, and with that knowledge develop her own objects, myths, and actions that she could relate to in terms of the temporal, geopolitical, and cultural context she found herself in. Some of Anni's writing suggests that she was concerned about her positionality as a white passing Iranian Armenian living in the Western neocolonial matrix, and more generally about how Armenians and other West Asians contributed to or fought against the four pillars of injustice that dominated all beings. One of her general aims was to continually be in the process of delinking from both Western and West Asian notions of patriarchy, ethno-racial superiority, and imperialism. I'll now move on to the work Anni made, starting with the context for this device, also known as a monobrow or heteronormative gaze deflector. For centuries, particularly in the Northwestern Hemisphere, people who were gendered as women were taught to remove most of their body hair in order to be beautiful, normal women. Individuals who did not believe in the justification of this idea would resist depilating their body hair, or in some cases would create the illusion of more hair through makeup. Traditionally, women in the regions that were known as the Middle East and North Africa emphasized their monobrows with black paint that provided relief from the sun's glare and protected against the evil eye. This practice was mostly wiped out due to the globalization of Eurocentric beauty norms, but remained particularly commonplace in the land known then as Tajikistan for reasons not yet clear in my research. In the West, some diasporans of Anni's generation, including herself, began to reclaim a cosmetically applied monobrow. She writes frequently in her Tumblr journal that not only does the monobrow have beauty in its own right, worth understanding, but that it could be used as what she called a heteronormative gaze deflector. This charm is based on a lute you may have noticed pictured in the previous slide. The instrument depicted is a setar, which is different to the larger and more commonly known sitar, though they share ancestors. With the setar, Anni began to learn the musical language of the Pomegranate Mountains. This embroidered talisman was intended to be worn as a necklace and helped the wearer transcend communication barriers. In her Tumblr journal, Anni writes that she created this charm around the time of a referendum vote that led people to believe that strength is not in unity and that minorities are to be punished for the government's irresponsible, greedy actions. Wearing the talisman helped her facilitate critical questioning among people who believed in the lies, and helped her defend her own and others' voices against the silencing effect of default people. Anni created this robe to perform magical and musical rituals in. She also used it as outerwear whilst visiting family as a young woman in Iran, which until 2049 required all people above the age of 7 who were gendered as female to cover certain parts of their bodies in public, regardless of individual cultural habits or religious beliefs. This robe protected Anni whilst in Iran in ways twofold: from punishment by the Islamic Republic's Revolutionary Guard, and from being perceived by her relatives as having nothing to show for being an artist. This is a ritual Anni devised during the autumn, or the season of letting go. She invited a small group of her friends to gather with her in a circle in a closed space at the alternative art school she attended at the time during a public event, but this ritual was not open to the public. They would pass round a pomegranate, drinking from a slit cut into the fruit. This was intended as an act of washing out things in one's heart or mind that needed to be let go of. Each of them would then take a seed from the fruit as it was passed around again, and would plant it in their mouths, planting seeds for whatever personal, political or spiritual intentions they have for the next season, whether that be the next physical season or a metaphysical one. Today, our communities perform different kinds of spiritual or symbolic actions for various purposes. We give each other the space to do so, but in Anni's time, such space was hard to come by. People's relationships to space were mostly mediated by money, an obsolete store of value that was, at one point, the main way to access goods and services. Money's distribution was deliberately made difficult or impossible amongst those who were not default or given systemic power. The pomegranate has symbolized life in multiple cultures since antiquity, and the widespread concept of the tree of life has found itself represented by the pomegranate in West Asian cultures. The fruit is normally harvested in the season of letting go. So it is symbolic that Anni set this ritual to take place towards the end of this season, and gave a handful of people, including herself, the space to set intentions towards winter, the season of deep sleep, so that they may begin to grow towards the spring. The ritual for renewal may not have been created if Anni did not take part in the alternative art school that she went to at the time. A post in her Tumblr journal states that it was simultaneously a privilege, yet exhausting, for her to fully participate in a free art school that makes me feel as if I should be grateful for being picked. But I am not free to be my full self in this space. I know that the painful stares of provincial ignorance will meet me if I carry out my artistic and political desires to their fullest extent. I almost feel that I'd rather be back in university. I'd be fighting similar problems, but at least I'd have my friends with me and more structural support. The details of Anni's practice as an ashur is where my research is currently trying to find answers. This is one of few images that I've uncovered so far in relation to her music. It seems to depict Anni imagining what it would be like to afford her own music studio. The drawing dates back to 2017, before she had studio access. We haven't actually heard her music yet, but with the Herstory Research Collective, we are developing a replica program that reads audio recordings that were uploaded onto digital platforms in the early 21st century. So what we know right now about her music is mainly from written accounts. By the late 2030s, Anni was part of a movement of multi-instrumentalist ashurs whose aims were to create new bridges across jazz, electronic music, West Asian folk music, and their descendant genres. She came to be seen as one of the musical activists of her generation, who helped create new ways of listening, understanding, and solidarity building across her audiences. Her practice would not have gone in the direction it did were it not for her gradual exposure to the music of Sun Ra, the alien deity who travelled to Earth via jazz and lived here in human form. He came to this planet to create his myth science orchestra, through which he would share his knowledge about the principles of discipline, beauty, unity, and freedom, the ancient past lost and the African future found, and, to quote Kojo Eshin, the secret science of funk. Sun Ra inspired generations of Afro-descendant and Afro-diasporic dreamers, makers, and thinkers, as well as those of other heritages, to imagine a world where physical and epistemic violence inflicted by the Western empires were not in our timeline. Anni was inspired by Sun Ra and his descendants to imagine a path to a future Earth through music and other forms. To conclude, the subject of my case study was one of a growing network of minorities whose practice aimed to change the paradigm they lived in through the power of intention, that is, through music and magic, or what would have been more popularly perceived as art in her time. By returning to lost or forgotten knowledge that had specific uses in its time and place, and by uniting that with the knowledge she was building within her own context, this artist found small yet significant ways to help shift the world into a new paradigm. Thank you.